It's the summer of 1758, and the people of Santa Fe are jolted awake by the ground shaking. 2,000 horses, hooves pounding like war drums, charge straight into the heart of their Spanish outpost. Comanche warriors, faces painted, lances gleaming, tear through the town, leaving chaos in their wake. This isn't just a raid. It's the opening shot of a Native American empire that'll bring Spain, Mexico, and the US to their knees. Over 15,000 square miles, bigger than Spain's own colonial grip, ruled by a tribe with no cities, no castles, just horses and sheer will. How did they do it? And what made this one attack a spark that lit a century of domination? Let's rewind the clock to a time before the Comanche were the terror of the plains. Back before the 17th century, they weren't even called Comanche. They were the Numunu, a small group of hunter-gatherers scraping by in the shadow of Wyoming's Rocky Mountains. They lived alongside their Shoshone cousins, chasing deer through the rugged terrain, using bows and spears, their feet crunching on pine needles and rocky soil. Life was tough, but simple, no different from dozens of other little bands scattered across the mountains. They had no clue that everything was about to change, all because of a four-legged beast they'd never seen before. Sometime in the late 1600s, the Numunu laid eyes on their first Spanish horse. Maybe it was a stray from a conquistador's herd, or maybe they spotted one during a rare brush, with Spanish traders pushing north from New Mexico. Either way, that moment flipped their world upside down. Picture a Numunu hunter, used to stalking game on foot, watching this massive animal gallop past, faster than anything he'd ever chased. It wasn't just a curiosity. It was a revelation. The horse wasn't just a tool. It was power on hooves. And the Comanche grabbed that power with both hands. Within a single generation, by 1700, they'd gone from trudging through the mountains to thundering across open ground. Kids who'd once learned to track deer through the underbrush were now born into a whole new reality. Imagine a Comanche mother, her newborn strapped tight to a cradle board slung on her saddle, rocking to the rhythm of a galloping horse. That baby's first lullaby? The thud of hooves and the whistle of wind. By the time those kids could walk, they didn't need to. They were already riding. The horse didn't just change how they hunted or fought. It rewrote who they were. This wasn't a slow evolution. It was a cultural explosion. The old Shoshone ways they'd grown up with started to crack and crumble. Back with the Shoshone, status came from things like family ties or hunting skills, on-foot steady, predictable stuff. But once the horse showed up, none of that mattered anymore. You didn't get respect because of who your parents were. You earned it by how fast you could ride, how many raids you could pull off, how many enemies you could outmaneuver. Picture a young Comanche warrior, maybe 15 years old, clinging to the side of a galloping horse, dodging arrows while his buddies cheer him on. That kid wasn't just playing around. He was climbing the ladder of a brand new society. The whole Numunu world reorganized itself around this animal. Families who'd once shared everything started splitting into bands, led by the best riders and raiders. Skill became the currency, and the horse was the bank. They didn't just ride whatever horses they found either. They got picky, breeding them for speed and stamina, turning scruffy mountain ponies into sleek war machines. A good horse wasn't just transportation. It was a status symbol, something you could trade for captives or goods. By 1700, a top-tier Comanche warhorse could fetch the kind of haul that made Spanish traders jealous. And here's where it gets wild. This wasn't just about survival anymore. The Comanche didn't adapt to the horse. They became the horse. Their entire way of life shifted to match its rhythm. Kids learned to ride before they could even toddle, strapped to their mom's saddles from day one. Elders who'd spent decades hunting on foot watched their grandkids grow up in a world they barely recognized. The mountains that had boxed them in for generations, they didn't matter anymore. By the late 1600s, the Comanche were itching to break out. And when they did, they wouldn't just leave Wyoming behind. They'd explode onto the southern plains, like a storm nobody saw coming. This was the birth of something massive. A tribe of modest hunters had turned into a mounted powerhouse in less than 30 years. The Spanish, who'd brought the horses to the New World in the first place, had no idea what they'd unleashed. One minute, the Numunu were a footnote in the Rockies. The next, they were rewriting the rules of power in North America. And they were just getting started. By 1700, the Comanche had cracked the code on horseback fighting. Imagine a rider at full gallop, sliding off the side of his horse to dodge arrows, then popping back up to fire off a volley while hanging from the neck. That's what they were doing, and they made it look easy. They'd figured out tricks nobody else had, turning their horses into shields and weapons all at once. This wasn't random. It was practiced, drilled into them until it was second nature. They built everything around the horse. They started breeding them, mixing fast Mustangs with tough Spanish horses, picking for speed and stamina. A good war horse could outrun anything and keep going for hours, worth 3 or 4 captives in a trade. That's how serious they were about getting the best. Kids grew up on horseback too. Babies rode in cradle boards, tied to their mom's saddles, feeling the gallop before they could crawl. By age 5, they were holding reins, not toddling around. Late 1600s, this obsession pushed them out of the mountains onto the southern plains, hitting 60 miles a day like it was nothing. Spanish scouts couldn't keep up. Their fighting style was nuts. They used 14-foot lances, perfect for stabbing from horseback, and carried shields made of layered buffalo hide that could stop musket balls. Picture a Comanche war party charging in, lances out, shields up, tearing through enemies before anyone could react. They mixed old step tricks with new ideas, built for the plains, fast and deadly. The Spanish didn't know what hit them. By 1700, a Spanish commander saw it firsthand and wrote it down. The finest light cavalry in the world. He wasn't wrong. The Comanche took the horse, ran with it, and turned it into something unstoppable. They weren't just riders. They were a force, ready to roll over anything in their path. By the early 1700s, the Comanche weren't just good on horseback. They were untouchable. Take spring 1706, for example. At San Juan Pueblo, Spanish soldiers woke up to a nightmare. Comanche warriors barreled in on horseback, moving so fast the ground shook. These guys weren't plinking away with slow shots. They were firing arrows at full gallop, hanging off their horses, impossible to hit. A Spanish musket took forever to reload. Maybe 20 seconds, if you were quick. In that time, a Comanche rider could loose 6 arrows, each one finding a target. The soldiers didn't stand a chance. Their fancy European weapons useless against this kind of speed. The Comanche knew exactly what they were doing. They watched the Spanish fumble with their muskets and timed their attacks to hit right when the guns went quiet. Reload time was their window, and they exploited it hard. Then there was the fake retreat trick. They'd charge in, act like they were running off, and the Spanish would chase them, thinking they'd won. Big mistake. The Comanche would spin around, lead them straight into an ambush, and wipe them out. A Spanish report from 1723 sums it up. They circle like whirlwinds, arrows coming from all directions. That officer wasn't exaggerating. He was just trying to explain the chaos to his bosses back home. Their horses were a huge part of this. The Comanche didn't settle for whatever nags they could find. They bred their own, mixing Spanish stock with wild Mustangs, going for speed, stamina, and grit. By 1740, they'd created something special. One of their elite mounts, lean and tough, could outlast 5 ordinary horses in a trade. These weren't just animals. They were war machines, built to run long distances and still fight fresh. The Spanish had brought horses to the New World for parades and heavy cavalry. But the Comanche turned them into something leaner, meaner, and way more practical for the plains. By 1740, their war parties were hitting targets across a 1,000-mile radius. That's not a typo. They could strike anywhere from the Arkansas River down into Mexico. No warning. No mercy. They didn't need daylight either. They'd ride under moonlight, using the glow to pick their targets, hitting Spanish settlements when everyone was asleep. Imagine waking up to hoofbeats and war cries. Too late to even grab your gun. They didn't just raid. They coordinated like an army. Multiple groups would hit different spots hundreds of miles apart, tying down Spanish forces in one place while they smashed another. It was slick, planned, brutal. The Spanish couldn't figure out how to stop them. A governor in the 1730s threw up his hands and wrote, "They've made a science of terror." He wasn't wrong. The Comanche didn't rely on guns, even though they knew about them. Muskets were slow, heavy, ran out of ammo fast. Arrows? You could carry a quiver of 20, fire them quick, and make more on the spot. They turned the Spanish advantage into a liability, dodging bullets while picking off soldiers one by one. Their riders could split up, circle back, hit from every angle, leaving the Spanish swinging at ghosts. This wasn't luck or chaos. It was a system. They trained their warriors young, taught them to read the land, the enemy, the timing. They'd watch how the Spanish moved, heavy and predictable, and flip it against them. Those feigned retreats? They'd lure cavalry into open ground, then cut them apart with lances and arrows. Their horses could keep going when the Spanish ones dropped from exhaustion. By 1740, the Comanche had turned the southern plains into their playground, and the Spanish were just visitors getting schooled. This was cavalry warfare, dialed up to a level Europe had never seen. And it was only the beginning. By 1740, the Comanche had figured out something the Spanish hadn't. You don't need walls or forts to run an empire. They took over the southern plains, not by planting flags or building towns, but by staying on the move. Picture one of their trade caravans rolling across Texas, nearly a mile long, hundreds of horses kicking up dust, every one loaded down with buffalo robes and goods. This wasn't just a shopping trip. It was a flex, a rolling billboard of their power. They didn't hold land like Europeans did. They controlled the spaces in between. And that's what made them unstoppable. Around the 1740s, they teamed up with the Kiowa, and that deal changed everything. The two tribes locked down every major river crossing, from the Arkansas River in the north to the Red River in the south. If you wanted to move goods or people across those waterways, you had to go through them. It wasn't about bullying anyone into submission like the Spanish tried to do. It was a partnership. The Comanche brought the horses and the muscle. The Kiowa pitched in with their own warriors and know-how. And, together, they turned the plains into a giant economic machine. Horses flowed north, buffalo hides went south, and they sat in the middle, calling the shots. Their summer camps were where it all came together. These weren't little hideouts. They were pop-up cities, sometimes thousands of people strong. Traders showed up from everywhere. Spanish merchants from New Mexico, French guys trekking down from the Missouri, even other tribes looking to deal. The Comanche ran the show, keeping everyone in line, making sure trades went smooth. Picture a dusty plain one day. Then overnight, it's a buzzing market. Horses snorting, hides stacked high, voices haggling in half a dozen languages. It wasn't just business. It was a power move. They'd roll out the welcome mat, but you knew who was boss. The horse trade was the backbone of it all, and they got smart about it. They didn't just swap whatever horses they had. They built a system. Pricing depended on age, training, bloodline. A young, fast horse, bred for war, might cost double what an older pack animal did. They knew their stock inside out, and they made sure everyone else paid top dollar for the best. By 1780, their camps were jingling with Spanish pesos, hard cash circulating right alongside hides and beads. New Mexico's colonial bigwigs had to rewrite their playbook just to keep up. A 1775 report put it blunt: the wealth of our provinces now flows through Comanche hands. They weren't kidding. The Spanish were hooked on Comanche trade and couldn't break free. This whole setup, what folks later called the Comancheria, wasn't about pinning down territory with borders. It was fluid, shifting with the seasons. Spring meant raids south into Mexico for fresh horses. Summer was for trading them north. Fall brought buffalo hunts. Winter sent robes south again. Their camps moved too. Big gatherings splitting into smaller bands when the grass ran low. It was chaos to outsiders. But to the Comanche, it was clockwork. They didn't need cities. They had mobility, and that let them outmaneuver everyone else. The Spanish and French showed up with their coins and goods, but they weren't in charge. The Comanche set the terms, decided the prices, and if you didn't like it, you could walk away empty-handed. They even turned old enemies into trade partners, like some Apache bands, setting up buffer zones to keep their core lands safe. By 1780, New Mexico's settlements were basically outposts in a Comanche world, surviving because the Comanche let them. This wasn't just scraping by. It was mastery, a whole empire running on horsepower and hustle, leaving the Europeans scrambling to keep up. By 1780, the Comanche had the plains locked down, and they played it smart. In 1783, a Mexican officer wrote, "Traders by morning, raiders by night." That's how they rolled. They'd show up in Santa Fe with horses and hides, sign a peace deal with the Spanish governor, then ride out and hit Texas settlements before sunrise. It wasn't random. They knew exactly how to keep the Spanish off guard, working one area against another. By 1800, Spain had no choice but to deal with them like a real country. The Comanche were too strong to ignore. They went after the Apache, who'd been big shots in Texas and northern Mexico. With constant raids, they pushed the Apache off the good buffalo lands and into the deserts. A missionary, watching it happen, said, "They flee like deer before wolves." The Apache couldn't hold on, abandoning spots they'd controlled for years. Because the Comanche kept coming, they didn't just fight, they made deals too. In New Mexico, they picked certain villages to trade with. The setup was straightforward. We guard your town. You let us sell and buy here. It worked. Comanche bands traded horses for tools or silver, and those villages stayed safe from attacks. By 1800, their chiefs were running the show like trade bosses. Some handled routes to specific towns. Others talked straight to Spanish or French traders. It was tight, organized, and kept goods moving. Then there's Ten Bears. In the early 1800s, he met some Spanish diplomats. They rode in expecting a small camp, but saw 10,000 people and 15,000 horses spread out over the plains. No fancy speeches, just a huge display of what the Comanche had. The Spanish couldn't believe it, scribbling down notes about a force they couldn't touch. It was clear. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement. By 1820, the Comancheria covered a massive area, from the Arkansas River down into deep Mexico. Their raids hit northern Mexico so hard that whole chunks of it emptied out. Towns got abandoned, farms sat empty, and Spanish troops stayed south of the Rio Grande. Unless the Comanche said otherwise, New Mexico's settlements only hung on because the Comanche allowed it. A Spanish general wrote in 1810, "We don't control the North. We just live where they let us." That's how it was. The Comanche made it work. By mixing war and trade, they'd sign a treaty in one place, raid another, and keep everyone guessing. Chiefs like 10 Bears turned camps into power hubs, showing off their strength without saying a word. They didn't need forts or titles, just horses, and a plan that kept them on top. Spain couldn't fight back. Mexico couldn't keep up, and the Comanche kept calling the shots. In spring 1820, the Comanche ran a horse market on the Red River with 20,000 horses, worth more than some Mexican provinces' budgets. Traders from Street Louis and Chihuahua showed up, dealing under Comanche rules. Different bands had specific roles. Some bred horses, others raided for them, some trained them. A buffalo hunting horse sold for 10 regular ponies. A war horse brought in way more, like a stack of silver or guns. By the 1840s, top Comanche families had piles of Spanish silver, French cloth, English guns. A trader in 1843 saw them with so many silver coins. They'd shoot them when bullets ran out. Chiefs owned thousands of horses, richer than big Mexican ranchers. They built the Comanche Exchange, trading buffalo robes to Mexico for metal, then swapping that for American goods. They kept it moving, turning cheap robes into big profits. By 1850, they controlled the horse trade across central North America. A Texas ranger in 1847 said, "Every mount from Red River to Chihuahua passes through their hands." That was dead on. Settlers and ranchers relied on them for horses. Bands managed it tight. Breeding, raiding, training, all feeding the system. A good horse could trade for enough to arm a group. Their camps had silver cups, fancy clothes with pearl buttons, stacks of rifles, showing they ran the show, and kept everyone coming back for more. In August 1840, the Comanche hit Texas hard with the Great Raid. They stormed Victoria and Linville, the second biggest port in Texas back then, and burned it to the ground. Hundreds of warriors swept in, grabbed everything they could carry. Horses, goods, you name it. They took so much stuff, their retreat slowed down. And that's when the Texans caught up at the Battle of Plum Creek. It was a bloody mess, both sides taking hits. But it showed Texas they weren't dealing with some small-time raiders. This was a full-on clash with an empire that had been running the plains for a century. The Texas Rangers had to figure out how to fight back. Their old tricks didn't work against Comanche speed. By the 1840s, they teamed up with Samuel Colt and got the Walker Colt revolver, a 6-shooter built for horseback. It wasn't like the slow muskets. You could fire it fast and keep moving. That changed things. Meanwhile, Buffalo Hump, the Comanche war chief who led the 1840 raid, kept Texans on their toes. By 1845, he switched up his style, sending smaller groups to hit and run. A Texas commander said it best. They strike like lightning, vanish like smoke. You'd blink, and they were gone, leaving burned-out farms and empty corrals. Then the 1850s rolled in, and the gold rush kicked off in California. Wagon trains started crossing Texas, loaded with people and gear, all pulled by horses and mules. The Comanche saw easy targets. They'd swoop in, steal the animals, and disappear. It wasn't just about loot. It slowed down the whole American push west. No horses, no travel. They hit the right spots at the right times, knowing exactly how to mess with the settlers' plans. By 1858, things were so tense. A Comanche chief sat down with the Texas Peace Commission and laid it out. We fight for hunting grounds. You fight for towns. Neither of us can win without losing everything. He wasn't wrong. Both sides were tearing up what they wanted to keep. But the Comanche edge started slipping by 1860. Those Colt revolvers were a game changer. Rangers could now shoot back fast, matching Comanche speed in a way muskets never could. Then there were the new long-range rifles, letting Texans pick off riders from farther away. That hurt. Worse, settlers kept pouring in. For every Comanche raid that torched a town, two more popped up. The plains were getting crowded, and the old hit-and-run tricks didn't pay off like they used to. Buffalo Hump's dispersed raids were smart, but they couldn't stop the flood of people. The Comanche still fought like hell. They'd target wagon trains moving through open country, stripping them of horses, leaving folks stranded. A single raid could nab dozens of animals, enough to stall a whole caravan. They'd ride in small packs, maybe 10 or 20 warriors, strike at dawn, and melt back into the hills. Texans tried chasing them, but good luck catching ghosts on horseback. The Rangers had to rethink everything. Ditch heavy gear, travel light, live off the land just to keep up. That's where modern guerrilla tactics started coming from, born out of necessity, against a foe that wouldn't stand still. By the late 1850s, it was a grind. The Comanche could still hurt Texas, but the settlers kept building. The gold rush kept the wagons coming, and every year brought more guns and more people. He was climbing the ladder of a brand new society. This wasn't a war anyone could win clean. The Comanche were losing ground, not because they couldn't fight, but because the game was changing. Horses and arrows couldn't outlast revolvers and sheer numbers forever. By 1860, the clash of empires was tilting, and the Comanche felt the squeeze. By 1860, the Comanche were still a force, but cracks were showing. In 1868, General Philip Sheridan flipped the script with winter campaigns. Normally, the brutal plains winters kept enemies away, giving the Comanche a break. When their horses were skinny and slow from the cold, Sheridan didn't care. He sent Union troops, fresh from the Civil War, loaded with repeating rifles and winter gear, straight into Comanche camps. They hit when the snow was deep, catching warriors off guard, horses too weak to run. It was a gut punch, tearing apart the safety net they'd always relied on. Then came Quanah Parker, a name you can't skip, born to a captured white woman, Cynthia Ann Parker, and a war chief, Pettinocona. He grew up knowing both sides. In 1874, he led 700 warriors to the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. They went after a trading post, packed with buffalo hunters, hitting it at dawn, with small groups moving fast, using the dark for cover. It was slick, one of their sharpest attacks ever. But those hunters had big .50 caliber buffalo guns. The long-range firepower chewed through the Comanche lines, and Quanah couldn't break through. They lost that fight, and it stung bad. The real killer came between 1872 and 1875. Buffalo hunters, armed with those same heavy rifles, went to work. In just 3 years, they wiped out over 3 million buffalo on the southern plains. That wasn't just animals dying. It was the Comanche economy crashing. Buffalo meant food, robes, trade goods, everything. An elder watching the slaughter said, "They're killing the heart of our world." He was right. Without the herds, their whole system fell apart. No more hides to trade, no more meat to eat, nothing to keep the camps going strong. Things hit rock bottom in 1874. On September 28, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie and the 4th Cavalry tracked the last free Comanche bands to Palo Duro Canyon, a huge, dry stretch they'd used as a hideout forever. Mackenzie didn't mess around. His troops found over 1,000 horses, the lifeblood of the Comanche, and slaughtered them. They shot them, drove them off cliffs, left the canyon, a graveyard of carcasses. For a people who lived and fought on horseback, that was it. The end of the line. They couldn't run, couldn't raid, couldn't rebuild fast enough. 9 months later, on June 2, 1875, Quanah Parker led the last holdouts to Fort Sill and surrendered. They walked in beat, out of options, But Quanah didn't just fade out. He switched gears, turned into a rancher, and started working deals with the U.S. government. He'd grown up with one foot in the Comanche world, one in the white one, thanks to his mom. And he used that. He raised cattle, negotiated for his people, kept them from getting totally crushed by reservation life. He lived long enough to see 1911, dying that year right beside his mother's grave at Fort Sill. They brought her body back to rest next to where he'd end up. A quiet end for a guy who'd fought so hard. This wasn't just a collapse. It was a slow choke. Sheridan's winter raids took their mobility. The buffalo slaughter took their wealth. And Palo Duro took their horses. Quanah's attack at adobe walls showed they could still hit hard. But those buffalo guns were too much. The hunters didn't care about treaties or borders. They just kept shooting until the plains were empty. Mackenzie's cavalry finished it, picking off the last pieces. By 1875, the Comanche who'd ruled for over a century were done as a free people, forced to adapt or disappear. Quanah picked adapt, and that's what kept their story alive. The Comanche left a big mark after their empire fell. The Texas Rangers got better fighting them, learning to ride fast and light, and that spread across the frontier. The U.S. cavalry copied their horseback moves, using them in later wars. Cowboys took Comanche cattle handling tricks, and the Spanish horses they bred became the backbone of the Texas cattle industry. Today, the Comanche are in Lawton, Oklahoma. They've got a language program with tech to keep it alive. In 2014, they taught U.S. Special Forces how to handle horses, using old skills for new jobs. They run businesses and casinos, making money to fund their culture and schools. They changed how we see Native history. They weren't just victims. They built an empire and forced Spain, Mexico, and America to deal with them. A historian said, "They made Spain, Mexico, and America adapt to their terms." That's true. They ran the plains for over a century, not as pushovers, but as a real power. The Rangers started in the 1830s to stop Comanche raids. By the 1850s, they'd learned to move quick with light gear, and that became the standard for frontier lawmen. The cavalry saw how Comanche hit and ran, covering 60 miles a day, and used it in their playbook. Cowboys got their cattle skills from Comanche horsework, and those bred horses drove the cattle boom in Texas. In Lawton, they keep their language going with recordings and apps. That 2014 Special Forces training showed their horse skills still matter. Casinos and businesses bring in cash for powwows and education. They're not fading out. They weren't a tribe that just took hits. They raided Mexico, traded with the French, and made Spain negotiate. For over 100 years, they called the shots. That historian's right. They bent 3 nations to their rules. Their legacies in ranger tactics, cavalry moves, cowboy ways, and a nation still standing strong. The Wild West is full of hidden empires like the Comanches, and there's more to dig into. Subscribe to catch the next one. Drop a comment. Who's your favorite Comanche leader? 10 Bears or Quanah? Hit like and subscribe to keep up.